My name is Emma Richardson, and 3 weeks ago I sat in the back corner of the Riverside Community Center in Millbrook, Ohio, watching my father brag to anyone who would listen about his brand new 3-bedroom ranch house in Oakwood Estates. He had the photos spread across the picnic table like they were treasure maps, pointing out the granite countertops, the 2-car garage, the small but neat backyard with its fresh sod. His chest was puffed out with pride, his voice carrying across the room as he told cousin after cousin about the mortgage he'd finally qualified for at 62, about how he'd worked his whole life for this moment. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned every single house in his neighborhood, all 47 of them. The community center where we sat, the land it was built on, the parking lot where his gleaming pickup truck was parked next to Uncle Pete's rusted sedan. I owned that too. While my father celebrated buying one house, I had quietly built an empire that stretched across 3 counties. But that's not where this story begins. That's just where it ends. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about family reunions is they have a way of shrinking you back down to size. Doesn't matter how far you've traveled, how much you've accomplished, how different your life has become. The moment you walk through those doors, you're 17 again, listening to your father tell you that college is a waste of money and you should be practical, get a job at the factory like everyone else in the family. You're the girl who had big dreams that everyone thought were too big, too unrealistic, too much. I had driven the 3 hours from Columbus to Millbrook in my Tesla, but I parked it 2 blocks away and walked to the reunion. Old habits die hard. Growing up on Pine Street, showing up with anything too nice was like wearing a target on your back. Better to blend in, keep your head down, let people think what they wanted to think. It had served me well for 34 years, and today was not the day to break that pattern. The Riverside Community Center smelled exactly like I remembered from high school dances and graduation parties. That mixture of industrial carpet, coffee that had been sitting too long, and the faint scent of pine sol from the janitor's closet. Round tables covered in plastic checkered tablecloths were scattered throughout the main room, each one anchored by a mason jar filled with daisies that someone had probably picked from their backyard that morning. This was Millbrook in all its modest, unassuming glory. This was home, even when it had stopped feeling like home years ago. I made my way quietly to the back corner, the same spot I used to claim at every family gathering when I was younger. The designated spot for the odd one out, the one who didn't quite fit the mold. From here I could see everything without being the center of attention. I could watch my brother Tyler work the room with his insurance salesman's smile, shaking hands and slapping backs like he was running for mayor. I could see my sister Jessica bouncing her toddler on her hip while she caught up with our cousins, all of them comparing notes on whose kids had started walking first, whose husband made the most money, whose life had turned out exactly the way it was supposed to. And there, right in the center of it all, was my father, Frank Richardson, wearing his best polo shirt and the kind of confident grin I hadn't seen on his face in years. He had claimed the prime real estate table, the one right in the middle of the room where everyone would have to pass by, and he had turned it into his personal showroom. Real estate brochures, printed photos, even a small model of his new house that he must have picked up from the sales office. He was holding court like a king, and for the first time in my memory, people were actually listening to him with genuine interest instead of polite obligation. I watched him describe the square footage to Uncle Pete, watched him explain the neighborhood amenities to Aunt Carol, watched him point out the proximity to the new shopping center to anyone who would stand still long enough. There was something beautiful about his excitement, something pure and genuine that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. This was his moment. After years of struggling to make ends meet, after decades of watching other people have the things he wanted, Frank Richardson finally had something to be proud of. What twisted in my stomach wasn't jealousy. It wasn't resentment. It was the memory of all the times he had looked at my dreams the same way other people were looking at his house photos now. With skepticism. With the kind of gentle condescension that comes wrapped in good intentions. When I told him I wanted to study business in college, he patted my shoulder and suggested I consider something more practical, like nursing or teaching. When I said I wanted to start my own company, he reminded me that Richardson women had always been good with their hands, not their heads. When I moved to Columbus and stopped coming home for every holiday, every birthday, every family obligation, He told people I was going through a phase, that I'd come to my senses eventually and move back where I belonged. He never meant to be cruel. Frank Richardson was not a cruel man. He was practical, cautious, protective, in the way that parents who have struggled their whole lives are protective of their children. He wanted to save me from disappointment, from failure, from the kind of dreams that leave you broken and empty-handed. But what he had saved me from, what he had protected me from, was his own understanding of what was possible. Now, watching him bask in the glow of his 3-bedroom ranch house, I realized that his limitation had never been about me. It had been about him. About the boundaries of his own experience, his own conception of success, his own ability to imagine a life different from the one he had always known. And in trying to keep me safe within those boundaries, he had inadvertently taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Sometimes, the people who love you most are the ones who see you least clearly. The Richardson family hadn't always been complicated. There was a time when Sunday dinners at my parents' house on Pine Street felt like the center of the universe, when the sound of my father's laughter could fill up our small kitchen and spill out into the backyard, where my mother hung laundry on the line. Those were the days when Frank Richardson came home from his shift at the Peterson manufacturing plant, with motor oil under his fingernails, and stories that made us lean forward across the dinner table, hanging on every word. I was 8, the first time he brought me to the factory on a Saturday morning. It was a special occasion, bring your kid to work day, though Peterson Manufacturing had never officially sanctioned such a thing. My father had simply decided that his youngest daughter should see where he spent his days, should understand what it meant to work with your hands and build something real. I remember the vastness of the factory floor, the way the machinery hummed and clanked in a rhythm that seemed almost musical, the way the other workers nodded respectfully when my father introduced me as his little girl. He was different there, at the factory, confident in a way I rarely saw at home. He knew every machine, every process, every shortcut that could save time without compromising quality. The younger workers came to him with questions, and he answered them with the patience of a teacher and the authority of someone who had earned his place through years of showing up, day after day, regardless of how he felt or what else was happening in his life. Watching him that day, I understood for the first time that my father was not just my father. He was Frank Richardson, a man other people depended on, a man who mattered. On the drive home, he stopped at Miller's Diner, the place Uncle Pete would eventually buy and run into the... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Round, before selling it to a chain restaurant that lasted exactly 8 months. Back then, it was owned by an elderly Greek man named Stavros, who made the best apple pie in 3 counties and knew everyone's order by heart. My father ordered coffee and a slice of pie for himself, chocolate milk and a grilled cheese for me, and we sat in the red vinyl booth by the window talking about everything and nothing. That was when he told me about his dreams, how he wanted to own his own house someday, something with a real front yard and maybe a workshop in the garage where he could tinker with old cars. How he wanted to take my mother on a real vacation, not just day trips to the lake, but somewhere with an ocean and room service and those little bottles of shampoo that she always talked about seeing on television. How he wanted to make sure all 3 of his kids had opportunities he never had, chances to be something more than factory workers if that's what they wanted. I was 8 years old, and I believed him completely. I believed that Frank Richardson could do anything he set his mind to, that the dreams he shared over chocolate milk and grilled cheese were not just wishes, but inevitabilities. I believed that our family was different, special, bound together by something stronger than the circumstances that seemed to define everyone else in Millbrook. Those Sunday dinners were the proof of that belief. Every week, our tiny house on Pine Street would overflow with aunts and uncles and cousins, with neighbors who had become family, and family who had become the foundation of everything I understood about love. My mother, Linda, would spend all of Saturday preparing, making 3 different kinds of casserole and 2 different desserts, setting up card tables in the living room when the dining room table wasn't big enough to hold everyone. Uncle Pete would arrive with his guitar, the battered old acoustic he'd had since high school, and after dinner he would play while Aunt Carol sang in her sweet, slightly off-key voice. My brother Tyler would organize elaborate games of hide and seek that involved every room in the house and half the backyard, while my sister Jessica, barely old enough to walk, would toddle from person to person, collecting hugs and bits of dessert that people slipped her when they thought my mother wasn't looking. My father presided over it all with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built something meaningful. He would sit in his recliner after dinner, stomach full and tie loosened, watching the controlled chaos of his extended family with the expression of someone who had gotten exactly what he wanted out of life. Sometimes I would catch him looking at my mother as she bustled around the kitchen, cleaning up and organizing leftovers, and the tenderness in his face was so raw and genuine that I had to look away. It was during one of those Sunday dinners, when I was 12, and starting to notice that our house was smaller than other people's houses, that our car was older than other people's cars, that my father pulled me aside while everyone else was arguing over a card game in the living room. We stood on the back porch, looking out at the yard that never quite got enough sun for my mother's tomatoes to thrive, and he put his hand on my shoulder with the weight of something important. He told me that money wasn't everything, that the richest people he knew were the ones sitting around our dinner table, arguing over who had cheated at hearts and whether Aunt Carol's famous banana pudding was better this year or last year. He told me that happiness wasn't about having the biggest house or the newest car. It was about being surrounded by people who would show up for you no matter what, people who would celebrate your victories and help you through your defeats without keeping score. I nodded along, absorbing what felt like wisdom. But even at 12, I was starting to understand that my father's philosophy was born as much from necessity as from choice. We didn't have money because we chose not to have money. We had love and laughter, and Sunday dinners, because those were the things we could afford, the things that didn't require credit checks or down payments, or any of the mysterious adult complications that seemed to govern the world beyond our front door. But I loved those Sunday dinners anyway. I loved the way my father's face lit up when Uncle Pete told the story about the time they got lost on a fishing trip and ended up sleeping in the car. I loved the way my mother hummed while she cooked, the way she would slip me extra dessert when she thought no one was looking. I loved the way Tyler would include me in the older kids' games even when I was too young to really understand the rules, the way Jessica would fall asleep in my lap during the guitar singing portion of the evening. Most of all, I loved the feeling that we were special, that the Richardson family had something that couldn't be bought or sold or taken away. We had each other, and in my 12-year-old understanding of the world, that was enough to overcome anything. It was also during those years that I started to notice my father's other dreams, the ones he didn't talk about over chocolate milk and grilled cheese. I would catch him sometimes, standing in the front yard on Saturday mornings, looking at the houses across the street with expressions I was too young to interpret. I would find him reading the real estate section of the newspaper on Sunday mornings, circling houses that were for sale, and then folding the paper away when anyone came into the room. One evening, when I was supposed to be doing homework but was actually eavesdropping from the top of the stairs, I heard my parents talking in low voices about money, about bills and overtime, and whether they could afford to fix the transmission in the car, or whether they would have to make do with one car for a while. My mother's voice was soft and worried. My father's was reassuring but tired, and I realized for the first time that the adults in my life were not as invincible as I had always believed. That was when I started paying attention to the things my father didn't say, the dreams he kept folded up like the real estate section of the newspaper. I started noticing that he worked more overtime than anyone else at the factory, that he came home exhausted but never complained, that he would sometimes sit at the kitchen table after dinner with a calculator and a stack of bills, his forehead creased with concentration. I started noticing that when people talked about their vacation plans or their home improvement projects or their children's college funds, my father would nod and smile and change the subject. Not because he wasn't interested, but because those conversations highlighted the gap between what he wanted and what he could have, between the dreams he shared with his 8-year-old daughter, and the reality he faced as a 40-year-old man with a mortgage and 3 children, and a job that paid enough to get by, but never enough to get ahead. But even knowing all of that, even beginning to understand the limitations that governed our lives, I still believed in the magic of those Sunday dinners. I still believed that love was enough, that family was everything, that the Richardson name meant something special. I believed that my father was a hero, even if he was a hero who drove a 10-year-old car and worried about money and had never taken a real vacation in his life. I believed that we were different from other families, stronger and closer and more resilient. I believed that no matter what happened in the world outside our small house on Pine Street, we would always have each other. I believed that the foundation we had built, Sunday dinner by Sunday dinner, laugh by laugh, story by story, was unshakable. I was wrong about almost everything, but I wasn't wrong about the love. The love was real, even when everything else fell apart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks before my high school graduation. I remember the date exactly because it was the same day my father came home from the factory with news that the plant was cutting another shift, that 23 people he had worked alongside for years were going to be laid off by the end of the month. The timing felt cruel, like the universe had decided to deliver hope and despair in the same afternoon mail delivery. I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to study for my calculus final when my mother walked in holding the envelope, her face carefully neutral in the way it always was when she was trying not to get her hopes up about something. The return address was printed in official university lettering, Ohio State University, Office of Admissions. We both stared at it for a moment, this thin, white rectangle that contained either everything I had been working toward for 4 years, or the confirmation that I would be spending the rest of my life in Millbrook whether I wanted to or not. My hands were steadier than I expected when I tore open the envelope. The letter was formal, polite, and started with the words I had been praying to see. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Fisher College of Business." I read the sentence 3 times, before the meaning fully registered, before I allowed myself to believe that Emma Richardson from Pine Street had actually done it, had actually gotten into one of the best business programs in the state. My mother let out a sound that was part gasp, part laugh, part sob. She grabbed the letter from my hands and read it herself, her lips moving silently as she processed each word. Then she pulled me into the kind of hug that lifts you off your feet, spinning me around in our tiny kitchen while tears ran down her cheeks, and she whispered, "I'm so proud of you," over and over like a prayer. That was when my father walked through the front door. I heard him before I saw him, the familiar sound of his work boots on the front porch, the jingle of his keys as he hung them on the hook by the door. My mother and I were still embracing when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face carrying the weight of whatever conversation he'd had with his supervisor that afternoon. He looked older than his 47 years, shoulders bent from decades of factory work, hair graying at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished and tired at the same time. My mother rushed to show him the letter, her excitement bubbling over as she explained about the acceptance, about the scholarship I had earned, about how his youngest daughter was going to be the first Richardson to go to college. She spoke quickly, breathlessly, the way she always did when she was trying to convince him to be excited about something before he had time to think of all the reasons why it might not work out. I watched my father's face as he read the letter, watched his expression shift from confusion to concern to something that looked almost like fear. He folded the paper carefully, handed it back to my mother, and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Tyler practicing basketball shots against the garage door in the backyard. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm, the tone he used when he was about to say something he knew we wouldn't want to hear. He started by telling me how proud he was, how smart I had always been, how he had always known I was capable of great things. But then came the word that changed everything, the single syllable that created a fault line through the center of our family. But college was expensive, more expensive than we could afford, even with the partial scholarship I had earned. But business was a field where success depended more on who you knew than what you knew, and we didn't know anyone who could help me get ahead. But I was still young, still naive about how the world really worked, still believing that hard work and good grades were enough to guarantee success. But there were other options, practical options, like the community college 20 minutes away, or the secretarial program at the vocational school, or the job opening at the bank downtown that came with benefits, and the kind of security that a college degree couldn't guarantee. Packed away, I sat there listening to my father explain all the reasons why my dreams were impractical, unrealistic, dangerous even, and I felt something inside me that I had never felt before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity that cut through years of believing that my family knew what was best for me. My mother tried to mediate, suggesting compromises and alternatives, her voice getting higher and more strained as she attempted to bridge the gap between my father's caution and my determination. But I could see in her eyes that she was already calculating costs, already wondering if maybe Frank was right, if maybe it would be better for me to stay close to home and choose something safer, something more suitable for a girl from our neighborhood. That was when Tyler and Jessica came in from the backyard, drawn by the tension they could feel even through the kitchen walls. Tyler, 16 and already planning to follow our father into factory work, listened to the conversation with the smug satisfaction of someone whose choices had never been questioned. Jessica, barely 13 but already showing signs of the same practical streak that ran through our family like genetic code, offered to give me her babysitting money to help with college expenses, an innocent gesture that somehow made everything worse. I excused myself from the table, walked upstairs to my bedroom and closed the door with the kind of quiet precision that speaks louder than slamming. I sat on my bed holding the acceptance letter, reading it over and over again, trying to reconcile the words on the page with the conversation that had just happened downstairs. This was supposed to be a celebration, a validation of all the extra credit assignments and weekend study sessions and sacrifices I had made to keep my grades high enough to earn a scholarship. Instead, it felt like a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome, a threat to the family harmony I had always taken for granted. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table with his calculator and his monthly bills, the same position I had seen him in countless times before. But this time, I noticed things I had never paid attention to. The way his shoulders curved forward when he concentrated. The way he rubbed his eyes when the numbers didn't add up the way he wanted them to. The way he sighed when he thought no one was listening. I sat down across from him, and for a moment, we just looked at each other across the scarred wooden table that had been the center of our family life for as long as I could remember. Then he started talking, not about college or scholarships or practical considerations, but about love. About how much he loved me, how terrified he was of watching me leave Millbrook and never come back, how he had seen other families torn apart when their children reached for things that were beyond their grasp. He told me about his own dreams when he was 18, about the plans he had made to save money, and maybe start his own automotive repair shop, about the girl he had been dating before he met my mother who had gone away to nursing school and never returned to Millbrook. He told me about the way disappointment could hollow you out if you let it, about the danger of wanting things you couldn't have, about the peace that came from accepting your place in the world, and finding contentment within the boundaries that life set for you. As he spoke, I realized that my father wasn't trying to limit me out of cruelty or jealousy or small-mindedness. He was trying to protect me from the kind of heartbreak he had experienced, trying to save me from a disappointment he was convinced was inevitable. In his mind, encouraging my college dreams would be like encouraging me to jump off a cliff, a form of parental negligence that he couldn't live with. But sitting there listening to him, watching the way his hands moved nervously over the bills spread across the table, I also realized something else. My father's fear of my failure was really a fear of his own inadequacy, his own inability to provide the kind of support and connections that he believed college success required. He wasn't trying to keep me small because he wanted me to be small. He was trying to keep me small because he was afraid that anything larger would reveal how small he felt. That realization changed something fundamental between us, created a space that hadn't existed before. For the first time in my life, I saw my father not as an authority figure or a protector or the man who knew all the answers, but as a human being who was just as scared and uncertain as I was. I saw him as someone who had given up on his own dreams so completely that he couldn't imagine how anyone else's dreams might be different, might be achievable, might be worth the risk. When I finally went to bed that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and making a decision that would reshape everything that came after. I was going to Ohio State. I was going to study business. I was going to build the life I wanted, even if it meant disappointing the people I loved most. And I was going to do it quietly, without fanfare or confrontation. Because I was beginning to understand that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones least equipped to understand who you're becoming. The acceptance letter was still on my dresser, and in the darkness I could just make out its white edge catching the moonlight from my bedroom window. Tomorrow I would mail in my acceptance, apply for additional financial aid, start planning for a future that felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. But tonight I just lay there feeling the weight of something ending, and something else beginning, knowing that I had just crossed a line I could never uncross. The next morning felt like waking up in a house that belonged to someone else. Everything looked the same. The faded wallpaper in the hallway, the squeaky third step on the staircase, the coffee pot that had been making the same gurgling sounds since I was 10 years old. But something fundamental had shifted overnight. The air felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made even ordinary conversations feel like navigating a minefield. My mother was standing at the kitchen counter when I came downstairs, methodically buttering toast with the kind of focused intensity that meant she was thinking about something else entirely. She looked up when I entered, her smile a little too bright, her voice a little too cheerful as she asked if I wanted eggs with my breakfast. It was the tone she used when she was trying to pretend everything was normal, the same voice she had used when my grandfather died, and she wanted to shield us kids from the weight of her grief. My father had already left for work, his coffee cup still sitting in the sink with the brown ring around the bottom that would require scrubbing to remove. I found myself staring at that cup longer than necessary, as if it could provide some insight into the man who had drunk from it, the man who had looked at his daughter's acceptance letter and seen only problems to be solved rather than dreams to be celebrated. Jessica was eating cereal at the kitchen table, her textbooks spread around her bowl in the organized chaos that characterized her approach to homework. She glanced up at me with curious eyes, clearly sensing that something significant had happened but not quite old enough to understand what it was. I envied her innocence, the luxury of living in a world where parents were still infallible and family loyalty was never complicated by competing visions of the future. Tyler appeared just as I was pouring myself a glass of orange juice, his hair still damp from the shower and his varsity jacket slung over his shoulder. He moved through the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world, grabbing a piece of toast from the counter and kissing our mother on the cheek before heading toward the door. But before he left, he paused next to my chair and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Dad's just worried about you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate our father's moods and expectations. "You know how he gets when he thinks one of us might get hurt. Give him some time to get used to the idea." I wanted to tell Tyler that this wasn't about time or worry or paternal protection. I wanted to explain that our father hadn't just expressed concern about my college plans. He had dismissed them entirely, had looked at 4 years of hard work and academic achievement, and reduced it to youthful naivete that needed to be corrected. But Tyler was already halfway out the door, and I could see in his face that he genuinely believed what he was saying, that in his understanding of our family dynamics, this was just another bump in the road that would smooth itself out with patience and understanding. The walk to school that morning felt longer than usual, each step taking me further away from the house where I had always felt safe and understood. Millbrook High School looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The same red brick facade, the same American flag hanging limply in the still morning air. The same clusters of students gathered on the front steps comparing homework answers and sharing weekend gossip. But I felt like an alien among them, carrying knowledge that set me apart from everyone I had grown up with. My first class was AP English, and Mrs. Henderson spent the period discussing our final research papers, the capstone projects that would determine our grades for the semester. She talked about the importance of pursuing topics that mattered to us, of using our academic skills to explore questions that would shape our future endeavors. Around me, my classmates took notes and asked questions about citation formats and page requirements, but I found myself thinking about the conversation with my father, about the gap between academic achievement and family support that I had never imagined could exist. During lunch, I sat with the same group of friends I had been eating with since sophomore year, listening to them discuss prom plans and summer jobs and college orientations, with the easy excitement of people whose paths forward were clear and uncontested. Sarah Martinez was going to study nursing at the State University, following in her mother's footsteps and fulfilling a family tradition that stretched back 2 generations. Mike Thompson had already been accepted to a trade school for automotive technology, a decision that had his father beaming with pride and talking about the garage they might open together someday. I wanted to share my news about Ohio State, wanted to feel the validation that comes from having your friends celebrate your achievements. But every time I opened my mouth to speak, I heard my father's voice explaining why business school was impractical, why I was setting myself up for disappointment, why I should choose something safer and more suitable for someone from our background. The words caught in my throat, and I found myself nodding along with other people's excitement, while my own dreams felt smaller and more fragile with each passing hour. It was during my afternoon study hall that I made the decision to call the admissions office at Ohio State. I had been carrying the acceptance letter in my backpack all day, reading and rereading it during every spare moment, trying to absorb the reality of what it represented. But I needed to hear another voice, an adult voice that wasn't colored by fear or family dynamics, confirm that this opportunity was real and achievable. The woman who answered the phone in the admissions office had a warm, professional voice that immediately put me at ease. She congratulated me on my acceptance, answered my questions about financial aid and housing options, and explained the process for confirming my enrollment. But more than that, she spoke to me with the respect and seriousness that comes from recognizing potential, from seeing a young person as someone capable of growth and achievement, rather than someone who needed to be protected from their own ambitions. "You should be very proud of yourself," she said near the end of our conversation. "Your academic record is impressive, and your essay about wanting to develop affordable housing showed real insight and maturity. We're excited to have you join our business program." When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt since reading the acceptance letter the night before. Hope. Not the complicated, conditional hope that depended on family approval and financial calculations, but the pure, undiluted hope that comes from knowing you have earned something significant, and that other people recognize your potential. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine walking across the Ohio State campus, sitting in lecture halls with professors who challenged my thinking, working on projects that could actually make a difference in the world. But that moment of hope was immediately followed by a crushing wave of loneliness. I was 17 years old, sitting in the empty hallway of my high school, holding a phone receiver that connected me to a future my own family couldn't understand or support. The woman in the admissions office had treated me like an adult, like someone capable of making important decisions about my life, but I was still a teenager who needed her parents' signature on financial aid forms and their emotional support as she navigated the scariest transition of her young life. The drive home from school was when the full weight of my situation finally hit me. I was going to have to choose between my family and my future, between the people I loved most and the life I wanted to build for myself. There was no compromise position, no middle ground that would satisfy both my father's need to keep me safe and my own need to grow beyond the boundaries of Millbrook. Either I would stay home and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been, or I would leave and risk losing the relationships that had always been the foundation of my identity. I parked in our driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, looking at the small house where I had lived my entire life, where every room held memories of laughter and arguments and quiet moments of connection. This was the house where my father had taught me to ride a bicycle in the backyard, where my mother had stayed up all night with me when I had pneumonia in 3rd grade, where Tyler and Jessica and I had built blanket forts in the living room on snowy winter afternoons. But it was also the house where my dreams had been politely dismissed, where my achievements had been measured against a standard of practicality that left no room for ambition or risk-taking. It was the house where love came with conditions, where acceptance was contingent on staying within carefully defined boundaries, where wanting more than what you had been given was seen as a form of ingratitude. When I finally walked through the front door, my mother was in the kitchen starting dinner, and the normalcy of the scene felt almost surreal. She was browning ground beef for spaghetti sauce, humming softly to herself while she stirred, and for a moment I could almost pretend that the previous 24 hours had been a strange dream. But then she looked up at me with eyes that held a question she wasn't quite ready to ask, and I knew that everything had changed, that we were all just pretending otherwise. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table eating spaghetti and making small talk about school and work and weekend plans, I felt like I was watching my family from a great distance. These people who had been the center of my universe for 17 years suddenly seemed like strangers. People whose lives were governed by assumptions and expectations that I was only beginning to understand. I loved them desperately, but I was starting to realize that love alone wasn't enough to bridge the gap between who they needed me to be and who I was becoming. The acceptance letter was still folded in my backpack, but it might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the meaning it held in that kitchen. I ate my dinner and answered questions about my day and helped clear the table, but part of me was already gone, already imagining a future where achievement was celebrated rather than feared, where dreams were nurtured rather than redirected, where being Emma Richardson meant something more than staying safely within the boundaries of Pine Street. The weeks following my acceptance to Ohio State felt like living in a house made of glass, where every conversation carried the potential to shatter something irreparable. My father had settled into a pattern of gentle but persistent discouragement, bringing up news articles about college graduates who couldn't find jobs, statistics about student loan debt, and stories of young people who had left small towns only to return years later, broken and disillusioned. He never said the words directly, never told me I couldn't go, but every morning brought a new reason why I should reconsider. My mother became the reluctant mediator, caught between her husband's practical concerns and her daughter's ambitions. I would catch her sometimes, standing at the kitchen window staring out at nothing, her hands gripping the edge of the sink with the kind of tension that spoke to internal conflicts she couldn't resolve. She wanted to support me, I could see it in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, but she also wanted peace in her household, wanted the kind of harmony that had always been more important to her than individual desires. Tyler's support, which had felt genuine that first morning, began to waver as the family dynamics shifted. He started making casual comments about people who thought they were too good for their hometown, about the importance of family loyalty, about how education could change people in ways that weren't always positive. Jessica, sensing the undercurrents but not understanding them, began asking innocent questions about why I wanted to leave, why I couldn't just be happy with what we had, why I needed to go so far away when there were perfectly good schools closer to home. But it was Uncle Pete who delivered the blow that nearly broke my resolve. He came for dinner on a Sunday evening in April, bringing with him the easy familiarity of someone who had been part of our family gatherings for as long as I could remember. After dessert, while my mother and Jessica were doing dishes and Tyler was in the living room watching television, Uncle Pete asked my father and me to join him on the back porch for what he called a serious conversation. The sun was setting behind the neighbor's house, casting long shadows across our small backyard, and the air still held the coolness of early spring. Uncle Pete settled into the old metal lawn chair that had been his designated spot for Sunday visits since I was small, and my father took his usual position, leaning against the porch railing. I sat on the top step, feeling suddenly like a child called before a tribunal of adults who had already reached their verdict. Uncle Pete started by telling me how proud he was of my academic achievements, how impressed he was by my determination and work ethic. But then his tone shifted, becoming more serious, more paternal, as he began to share what he called some hard truths about the world. He told me about a young woman he had known years ago, a brilliant girl from a working-class family who had won a scholarship to a prestigious university. She had gone away full of dreams and ambitions, but the culture shock had been overwhelming, the social and economic differences between her and her classmates insurmountable. She came back after 2 years, Uncle Pete said, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering a cautionary tale. Broken, defeated, owing money she couldn't pay back. She never recovered from it, Emma, never quite found her place again, either in the world she had tried to enter or in the one she had left behind. As he spoke, I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a fear that had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness but that I had been fighting to ignore. What if my father was right? What if I was naive about the challenges I would face, unprepared for a world where success depended on connections and cultural capital that I simply didn't possess? What if my determination to leave Millbrook was just youthful arrogance disguised as ambition? My father nodded along with Uncle Pete's story, his expression grave and concerned. Then he added his own perspective, talking about the importance of being realistic about your place in the world, about the danger of reaching for things that were beyond your grasp. He spoke with the authority of someone who had learned these lessons through hard experience, who had made peace with limitations that I was still too young and stubborn to accept. "We love you too much to watch you set yourself up for heartbreak," my father said, his voice gentle but firm. "There's nothing wrong with staying close to home, with building a good life here in Millbrook. Your mother and I have been happy here. Your grandparents were happy here. Why do you think you need something different?" That question hung in the air between us, and I realized that I didn't have an answer that would satisfy them. How could I explain that happiness meant something different to me than it had to previous generations of Richardson women? How could I articulate the feeling that staying in Millbrook would be like slowly suffocating? That accepting their vision of a good life would mean giving up essential pieces of myself that I was only beginning to discover. I mumbled something about wanting to explore my options, about college being a valuable experience regardless of where it led, but my words sounded weak and unconvincing even to me. Uncle Pete and my father exchanged a look that clearly said they had made their point, that they had planted the seeds of doubt they had hoped to plant. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I remained on that porch step feeling smaller and more uncertain than I had since receiving my acceptance letter. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would define the next 15 years of my life. I was going to Ohio State, but I was going to prove them wrong in the process. I wasn't just going to survive college. I was going to excel in ways that would make their concerns seem ridiculous in retrospect. I was going to build something significant, something undeniable, something that would force them to reconsider every assumption they had made about what Emma Richardson was capable of achieving. But more than that, I was going to do it quietly. I wasn't going to argue with them anymore, wasn't going to try to convince them that my dreams were valid. I was going to let them think they had won, let them believe that their practical wisdom had guided me toward more realistic expectations. And then, when I had built something remarkable, when I had exceeded every boundary they had set for me, I would return to Millbrook and show them exactly how wrong they had been. College passed in a blur of late nights in the library, internships at real estate firms, and summers spent working construction jobs to pay for expenses my partial scholarship didn't cover. I called home every Sunday, but I kept the conversations light, focused on classes and weather and harmless campus activities. I didn't mention the real estate license I earned during my sophomore year, or the small apartment building I purchased and renovated during my junior year, or the networking connections I was building with professors and industry professionals who saw potential in the determined young woman from Millbrook. My family seemed relieved by my apparent adjustment to college life, interpreting my silence about future plans as evidence that I had outgrown my grandiose ambitions. When I came home for holidays, I wore my oldest clothes, drove the used car I had bought with construction wages, and carefully avoided any conversation that might reveal the scope of what I was building. I let them think I was just another college student, maybe a little more studious than most, but ultimately someone who would graduate and settle into a modest career that would bring me back fully to their orbit. But while I was maintaining that facade, I was also learning everything I could about real estate development, property management, and commercial lending. I was studying markets and demographics, attending industry conferences, and building relationships with investors who were impressed by my combination of analytical skills and hands-on experience. By the time I graduated, I had already flipped 3 properties and was preparing to purchase my first small commercial building. The transition from college to full-time real estate development was seamless, because I had been building my business throughout my undergraduate years. While my classmates were sending out resumes and hoping for entry-level positions, I was already running a small but profitable operation that generated enough income to support my modest lifestyle and fund my next investment opportunities. My family assumed I had taken a job with a real estate company in Columbus, and I never corrected that assumption. When they asked about my work, I spoke vaguely about property management and market analysis, using language that was technically accurate but gave no indication of the scale of my operations. When my mother worried about me living alone in the big city, I assured her that I was being careful with money and making sensible choices, which was true, even though my definition of sensible had evolved considerably since leaving Millbrook. The first 5 years after graduation were a carefully orchestrated dance between aggressive business expansion and deliberate family communication management. I was acquiring properties throughout Central Ohio, building relationships with contractors and investors, and establishing myself as someone who could identify undervalued markets and transform them into profitable developments. But every time I came home for Christmas or Easter or family birthdays, I downplayed my success, dressed modestly, and maintained the fiction that Emma Richardson was just getting by in the adult world. I told myself I was protecting them from worry, that they wouldn't understand the risks I was taking, or the long hours I was working. But the truth was more complicated than that. I was protecting myself from their fear, from their need to reduce my achievements to something manageable and non-threatening. I was also, though I wouldn't admit it for years, punishing them for their lack of faith in me, for the way they had tried to convince me to settle for less than I was capable of achieving. The business grew steadily, then rapidly. By my late 20s, I owned dozens of residential properties and had developed my first subdivision, a modest collection of starter homes that sold quickly to young families looking for quality construction at affordable prices. My reputation in the Columbus real estate market was solid, my financial foundation secure, and my vision for future projects increasingly ambitious. But success brought its own form of loneliness. I was building something remarkable, exceeding every goal I had set for myself as an 18-year-old, with an acceptance letter and a dream, but I had no one to share it with. My family remained convinced that I was just scraping by in a career they didn't understand, and my professional relationships, while productive, lacked the emotional intimacy that comes from being truly known and understood. It was during my 10th year in Columbus that I made the decision that would ultimately lead me back to that family reunion at the Riverside Community Center. I was going to develop a luxury subdivision in Millbrook, a collection of upscale homes that would transform the economic landscape of my hometown, while providing me with a base of operations closer to my family. I told myself it was a smart business decision, an opportunity to apply my expertise in a market I understood intimately. But beneath the business rationale was something more personal, more complex. I wanted to come home, but I wanted to come home as someone who had proven every doubt wrong, someone who had built something undeniable. I wanted my family to see not just what I had accomplished, but what they had almost prevented me from accomplishing. The Willowbrook Heights development took 3 years to plan and execute. 3 years during which I quietly purchased every piece of available land on the outskirts of Millbrook, assembled a team of architects and contractors, and designed a community that would be unlike anything the town had ever seen. 47 homes ranging from modest family houses to executive estates, all built to the highest standards, all priced to attract the kind of buyers who would elevate Millbrook's profile and property values. I managed the entire project from Columbus, making regular trips to oversee construction, but maintaining enough distance that most people in Millbrook didn't connect. Emma Richardson, the developer with Emma Richardson who had grown up on Pine Street. The few times I encountered people I had known in high school, I kept the conversations brief and vague, allowing them to assume I was just another out-of-town professional working on the new development. The houses sold quickly, attracting young professionals from Columbus who wanted small-town charm with big city amenities, empty nesters looking to downsize without compromising on quality, and established families seeking communities with excellent schools and safe neighborhoods. Within 18 months of completion, Willowbrook Heights had transformed the eastern edge of Millbrook into the town's most desirable address. And that was when my father, after years of renting a small house near the factory, finally had enough money saved for a down payment on his dream home. A 3-bedroom ranch with a 2-car garage and a neat front yard, located in the newest, nicest neighborhood in Millbrook. A house that, unbeknownst to him, had been designed and built by his youngest daughter, the one whose business school dreams he had tried so hard to redirect 15 years earlier. When I received the call from my mother about my father's house purchase, about how proud and excited he was to finally achieve this milestone, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I'm still not sure I fully understand. Pride in what I had built, satisfaction at having proved my doubters wrong, but also a deep sadness about the distance that had grown between us, the years of careful silence that had allowed this moment to happen. The family reunion invitation arrived 2 weeks later, and I knew immediately that this would be the moment of revelation I had been unconsciously building toward for 15 years. I would sit in the back corner of the Riverside Community Center, I would listen to my father proudly describe his new house to anyone who would listen, and then I would decide whether or not to tell him that his daughter owned not just his house but every house in his neighborhood. As I drove the 3 hours from Columbus to Millbrook that reunion morning, I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had sat at the kitchen table holding an acceptance letter while her father explained why her dreams were impractical. I thought about the years of careful silence, the deliberate distance, the empire I had built while my family remained convinced I was just getting by. I thought about love and disappointment, and the strange ways that family relationships can survive even when they're built on fundamental misunderstandings. And as I walked into the Riverside Community Center that afternoon, wearing my most modest clothes, and parking my Tesla 2 blocks away, I realized that I was about to find out whether 15 years of proving them wrong had been worth the cost of letting them believe they had been right all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.